Hey students, welcome to your Chapter 1 lecture. Before we get started, I wanted to give you some suggestions for success in this course and success on your assignments and quizzes. So before you get started on your audio lecture, please make sure you have read the chapter beforehand. The audio lecture is really meant to reinforce the concepts and terms that you've already read, but also to allow for more depth and experience and understanding, some specifics, examples, and things like that. So I would highly recommend having that chapter read beforehand. Before you get started on the audio lecture, I would also recommend going ahead and printing up the audio lecture. PowerPoint allows you to print it up so you have a section for comments on the side. Go ahead and do that. And as you listen to the audio lecture, I would recommend taking active notes and listening actively to the lecture. In terms of the quizzes, questions will come from both the audio lecture and the book. So you want to have all of your resources out when you go to take these quizzes. Lastly, if you're doing all of these things and not doing well on your quizzes, please reach out. I am here to support you. Oftentimes we can kind of go through the questions together and I can get a sense of where you're coming from. So again, if you're not doing well or as well as you would like to be doing, please reach out. I am here to support you. The first thing we'll be doing for Chapter 1 is outlining our objectives. The first objective we have is to become familiar with the sociological perspective and understand the mutual relevance of sociology and criminology. We'll also be able to trace the rise of sociological criminology. We'll understand the relationship between crime, deviance, and criminal law. We'll understand how consensus and conflict perspectives contribute to different definitions of crime and our understanding of criminal law. We'll be able to provide an overview of criminal law, including the goals of criminal law, legal distinctions and types of crimes, the meaning of criminal intent, and the legal defenses of criminal liability. Lastly, we'll be familiar with the various types of research methods in criminology. So before I start covering some of the more traditional content that I generally cover in a Chapter 1, I wanted to address COVID and crime. So things have been changing so incredibly fast. It's even been hard for me to keep up on these lectures because things are changing so fast. I want to say take some of these numbers with a grain of salt because again, things are changing so fast. And in understanding, how we can look at crime in this way, those changes are really fundamental to what Durkheim, our father of sociology, Emile Durkheim, called anomie. And anomie, he said, was a sense of normlessness. It was a sense of not knowing what was coming next. And as you can imagine, especially in those first few weeks, COVID really put most of us in a collective state of anomie, right? It was a scary time. We still didn't know how dangerous the virus was. We didn't know when we'd be going back to work. We didn't know if we'd have jobs. I mean, it was incredibly stressful. Will our kids ever go back to school, right? And so not only the stress, but the normlessness, right? And again, Durkheim wrote a whole book on this, on anomie and the sense of normlessness. And he said during these times of rigorous change, and I wanted to mention, just as a society, we've been changing incredibly fast, like the last 150 years. So on top of that, we now have COVID to deal with. And in terms of understanding, we have to look at how our routine activities were really impacted. So like so many of you, I got up, I went to work, I hung out with my kid, I hung out with my friends, right? And obviously with the lockdown and everything else, everything shifted online. Sports and things that folks usually use to distress were no longer available. I mean, those first few weeks, we weren't even really supposed to be walking outside like without a mask, right? So incredibly stressful. And of course, our routine activities were left, were kind of up in the air. And they changed. And so because of those changes, we also saw changes in crime rates. For instance, things like residential burglary actually decreased during especially those first couple weeks. It, shouldn't seem crazy to think, but it's because everybody was at home, right? Most burglars actually don't want to be confronted by you, which is why we see most burglaries happening during the day when people are at work. So we saw a decline in residential burglaries, but we also saw an incline for commercial retail establishments. And of course, using what we know as routine activities theory, we come to understand, right? Well, that was probably because there was no one there guarding, the loot. Um, and so routine activities theory has three different dimensions. The first dimension is the likely offender. The second dimension is having a suitable target. And the third dimension is the absence of guardianship. And so when these three dimensions converge, the idea is that likelihood of crime will increase. And so, again, these changes in our behavior have also impacted crime rates. So overall, we've seen a decline in certain crimes. Crimes like theft, robbery, assault have actually decreased. It's really interesting. There was a study in 2021 by Abrams, and he looked at 25 of the largest cities in the U.S. and he actually found a decline in simple assault by 33% and a decline by aggravated assault by 16%. If you don't know the difference between the two, one does great bodily harm. The other is something like, getting punched in the face or something, but not causing great bodily harm. Um, and really, the thing that really defines the two is usually use of weapon, right? A gun or something like that, because that helps with bodily harm, right? And so, interestingly, we did see a decrease in those types of crime. They also looked at things like rules around the lockdown. So they found that those with stricter rules had more dramatic declines. So there definitely seems to be a relationship between how strict rules were and crime rates. And so, in understanding routine activities theory, we also might look at something like the increase in cybercrime. There was so much fraud online, you guys, so much. And you have to, think about it. The computer at this time became central to our lives, right? It was our only way of staying connected, whether it was school or work or even friends with happy hours or all these Zoom meetings people were putting together. Um, and so, the internet was central, but we also saw the increases in things like fraud and harassment and hate crimes online, hacking, phishing, and especially things associated with COVID. So I know in Washington state, we had massive fraud of billions of dollars when it came to unemployment. And a lot of that had to do with, we wanted to get these resources out to folks really quickly. And I'm not sure a lot of the vetting process was the same. And of course, the unemployment office was not ready to, start processing so many more applications or, submissions of unemployment. So, um, you know, again, it all kind of makes sense when you think about in terms of that idea of routine activities. What is everyone doing right now, right? There's lack of guardianship. The unemployment office did not have the same amount of people. You have likely offenders. There's people just sitting around on their computers all day long, right? Some of them with nothing to do, right? And so, we also saw large increases in things like phishing scams. This is where people send out emails with they want you to click on something, fraud in terms of like fundraising for COVID relief and things like that. So, um, lots of malicious phishing, asking for, sending people different links and things like that, hacking. I've seen so many, especially old folks, getting hacked on Facebook. I'm getting multiple friend requests, and I'm like, I think you were hacked. I had to call my mother-in-law to tell her she was hacked the other day. And a lot of some of the groups are more vulnerable, right? Senior citizens oftentimes don't have like the tech background that some of the younger generation does. And so that's something to also consider. When we look at COVID cross culturally, we have to be a little bit more careful because in understanding why crime rates might be different from country to country, there's also so many variables in terms of systems, right? Like your medical system, your government, like how everything is functioning. There could be other things that are impacting folks as well. Is your government providing you unemployment for X, Y, and Z, which a lot of people that were traditionally not included in unemployment were included during COVID. And so that's why we see some inconsistency in terms of research across regions when it comes to crime rates. But again, you have to be there's so many variables going on right now. And I think we'll have a much better understanding with some time, but of course, we're trying to make sense of this right now. So the next theory we'll look at is a theory by a man named Robert Agnew, and he coined this theory, strain theory. And to be honest, a lot of these ideas, theories are just explanations for crime, and many of these you've probably had in your own head, but you weren't quick enough to write it down and explain it because that's why these guys get their notoriety. So, um, Robert Agnew looked at strain, right, or stress that's experienced by certain groups. And he again had three kind of dimensions of strain theory. And with the convergence of these things happening together, or two of them happening, or even one of them happening, he said that we would see an increase in stress and strain and thus higher crime rates, especially when it comes to those stress induced crimes like violent crime, right? Things that aren't premeditated. So, the three dimensions under strain theory look at one, the failure to achieve goals, two, the presentation of negative stimuli, and three, the removal of positive stimuli. And again, anytime you see the convergence of these three factors is where you're more likely to see strain, right? And you don't have to look very hard to see the strain and stress that was produced with COVID, right? And obviously, when people experience this, oftentimes they want some kind of release, right? And so you see more folks turning to things like drugs and alcohol, which we saw an increase of during COVID. You also might see someone turning to something like a gang. Maybe all of the extracurricular activities now are completely closed down. He can no longer play basketball on his basketball team or baseball. And there are these kids outside that are accepting of him. And so, while people are experiencing this strain, one of those was the removal of a positive stimuli. For many kids and juveniles, sports are a huge outlet. Community organizations, right? These were all shut down. Again, these are the things that give people identity and give people meaning in their lives, right? Um, Another one we might look at is failure to achieve goals. I've had all kinds of students who have had a really hard time functioning online. Maybe you're one of them. Um, but some students, it's just not for them. And so it's been really, really hard for, otherwise A students who just can't do it online. They don't like it. And you can see how this is really putting a roadblock to their goals, right? So, again, creating stress, creating turmoil for folks. And so, it's also stuff that kind of triggers people sometimes. Um, the other component we'll look at is that removal of positive, another one is removal of positive stimuli. So many folks have had people die, especially people of color have been hit really, really hard by COVID. If you can imagine losing a parent or something like that, again, all of the institutions are closed down. You can't achieve the goals that you want to achieve. It makes sense why people might turn to crime. And so, again, strain theory, routine activities theory, they really give us an understanding of, what has happened and why, right? Again, as criminologists, we don't have all of the answers, but we're doing our best. And, with time, we will have a better understanding of what's actually happening right now. But just to give you some comparison, in 2008, when we had the Great Recession, we did not see these increases in crime. In fact, what's interesting is at that time I had just started teaching, and we saw all of these students coming back to the community colleges. I had lines out the door for students trying to add classes that were already filled. Today, a pattern. Enrollment's pretty bad for most of the community colleges. Students are not choosing to go to school. And we're trying to understand that at the college as well. What's going on? What are they doing instead? If you have any ideas, let me know. But it is interesting to think about. I think one thing is the economy is really good. So maybe people are kind of good at this point. Things are changing. So maybe people are trying to hold on to good paying jobs right now. And so maybe work makes more sense. Maybe because of COVID, people just want to live their best life, and maybe school is not part of that because they want to go explore. Maybe they're not going down the traditional route is kind of what I'm saying. And so it's just interesting in terms of the difference between 2008 and now with COVID, um, because we saw really, really different outcomes. And I think, it gives us some kind of sense of comparing and understanding, and well, what is different? Because during that time there was, it was a global financial crisis, right? People were losing their homes. You would think this would also make people really stressful. Um, but we didn't see the large increases in especially gun related violence that we're seeing now. And so I mentioned that, a lot of property crime had gone down, but we are seeing increases in gun related violence, especially in especially Black communities. And using routine activities theory helps us understand, because many of these folks were vulnerable to begin with, right? Living in areas that are high crime areas, so they're more vulnerable to being victimized. But the Black community is already kind of vulnerable to begin with, and then adding on, COVID hit them way disproportionately than the rest of the other races, right? They were, so losing loved ones, seeing loved ones sick, all of these had a really, defining thing for Black communities. Many of the jobs for Black folks are more working class jobs, right? They're not the ones that can easily be moved to remote. And so you saw increases in unemployment for this group, as well as with that increases in substance abuse, which we saw across, racial lines. So again, this made a very vulnerable population even more vulnerable. And there are other types of crimes that we can look at too, things like hate crime that we saw among Asian communities. This idea, and we can really come to look at this sociologically, in that there's still racism for Asian folks, right? Even though they're known as the model minority and they've been able to do really well in terms of resources, when it comes to otherness, they're still very susceptible. And we saw that in violence against Asian Americans. And so that didn't come out of nowhere, right? And not that I am dismissing this behavior at all, but in understanding it, to understand it, we understand, this is coming from fear, right? People were fearful of what was happening and they needed someone to blame. This is consistent with other patterns we've seen throughout history. Look up the Yellow Peril, where you saw very similar anti-Asian sentiment. Um, Also, after Hiroshima, we saw the same. So, very, very similar patterns. And this is essentially the reason I wanted to share this COVID and crime lecture or piece of the lecture with you, is because it's always changing. Right now we're still trying to make sense of it, but we can use what we have, and gain some understanding. In order to look at crime and deviance from a sociological perspective, it's really important that we understand the society in which we are looking at. So, understanding things like the systems, the way they function, our history, our values, all of these things really come to create an understanding as to why our systems function the way they do. For instance, there is a popular saying within our ethos. It says, "You do the crime, you do the time." I'm pretty sure most of you have likely heard this, right? And this comes from a very individualistic perspective, and it's not random. We are a very individualist country. Um, and so the idea is, oh, you do the crime, you do the time. We're not going to consider any of the history. We're not considering any of the social structure. And looking at why some groups are much more impacted by the criminal justice system than others. And so, what we're going to be doing in sociology is getting a sense of looking at things a little bit more critically and deeply, right? Understanding the connections between like our capitalistic system, right, and how it comes to impact crime and deviance, but also how our criminal justice system functions. Right now, about 8% of our prisons in the US are run for profit. So this means their bottom line is to make money, right? It's not random. They've been set up, they've been built, and they want to keep those beds filled, right? So what do? They go to they buy lobbyists and send them to Congress, and these people try to lobby their needs, right? And so it might be we want a harsher punishment for drugs or something like that because they know that this particular law might increase their numbers. And so that's what I'm saying, where it's really important that we're looking more deeply at, not just saying, oh, you did the crime, you did the time, but looking at the factors, that contribute to this, right? Why might we see 4 generations of folks going to prison, right? What's happening there? A lot of folks will go, well, this runs in the genes. Well, it's a lot more complex than that. There is some evidence that genes do matter. But there's also a really important interplay when it comes to the environment, especially when it comes to child development, right? And so, when growing up, did you feel loved? Did you feel, were you taken care of? Did you feel secure? All of these things come to matter, right? Especially when we look at things kind of outside traditional crime like drug use. And I only say that because I know most people think of it as a traditional crime. But in understanding, so many of these folks that end up as hardcore addicted to drugs have underlying childhood trauma. And so if we're not really looking deeply at this stuff, if we really want to fix it, we need to really be looking at, how can we reframe our systems to better support parents during the first 5 years of life? Because there's all kinds of research about, how that comes to impact juvenile delinquency, crime rates, all across the board. And so, again, looking at crime and deviance from the sociological perspective, we're going to analyze it through systems. We're going to analyze it through that personal interaction, looking at how people are brought up. But we're also going to be looking at things critically, right? Like, it's the powerful who are creating the laws. Oftentimes, they're not going to create laws that are going to hurt them, right? And we saw this with the crack and powder cocaine disparities, right? Whites were much more likely to do cocaine, but the disparity in terms of punishment was 101, right? Meaning they needed 100 times the amount of powder cocaine as crack to get the same amount of sentence or the same sentence. And again, what's meaningful about this is that Black folks were the ones who were more likely to be smoking crack. And so their punishments were much more harsh, And so, even looking at the opioid epidemic, we could look at it the same, right? And so, looking at this, trying to come up with solutions and how we can, fix some of these problems. And I think because of the way we've been going for the last 20, 30 years, we've created many problems, right? And so it's not, none of this is an easy fix. It took us a long time to get here, and a lot of it had to do with just locking folks that were addicted to drugs, locking them up and throwing them away the key, right? And sometimes that works, but a lot of the time it doesn't. And so, this class is hopefully going to teach you to be a lot more critical in terms of who gets what punishment, how crimes are even defined, and how they come to impact the individual. So hopefully you're starting to get a sense of how we look at crime from a sociological perspective or looking at the social phenomenon happening. We will also be looking at biological and psychological perspectives of crime, which say that there's something different about the individual. But sociology really offers the most understanding, because if crime was simply biological or psychological, then we should see patterns and trends pretty similar across time and across space. So for instance, if we looked at something like gun violence in the US, we would definitely have to consider how many guns we have in the US in terms of understanding. Because when dynamics happen, when fights happen, people are more likely to pick up a gun if there is one there, right? So, just to give you some understanding, according to the Small Arms Survey, they did a survey of folks across nations and getting a sense of gun ownership. This was done in 2017. So, what they found was although the US only comprises about 4% of the world's population, its civilians own about 40% of the world's firearms, right? And so, again, creating this understanding, why is gun violence so high here? Well, we have a lot of guns. and we have a lot more guns than most countries. And so, of course, that doesn't give us the only understanding, but it's a big one. So, before we get started on some of these key terms that we'll be using throughout the course, I first want to introduce you to this idea of a norm. And a norm is an expectation that guides our society. And we have thousands of norms, and norms really keep society moving smoothly. And norms will vary across time and space. And so, prior to COVID, the norm in the US was when you met someone, you would put out your hand and shake their hand, right? And so if I had decided, no, I'm not shaking your hand, and I just kind of snuffed you, that would have been considered a deviant act, right? Or an act that went against the norm. Now, of course, I wouldn't have been locked up for that. It wasn't a crime, but I definitely went against the norm of the society. Post COVID, it's definitely changed. So that's an important idea in that norms change across time and across space. And, when it came to COVID, it was about survival, right? If we were shaking hands with everybody, we quite possibly would have been spreading the disease even more. So, deviance can be considered a crime. And so you're going to see an overlap in some spaces. So, for instance, killing someone is still considered a deviant act. And it's also considered criminal. But again, something like going to school in your bathing suit is not considered a crime, but it's definitely a deviant act, and you'll receive sanctions from folks, right? So folks might give you weird looks, and these are ways in which we exert social control. What the heck are you doing wearing your bathing suit today? Maybe the next time you're like, oh no, that was too embarrassing, or something like that, right? And so the difference between crime and deviance, there's an overlap, and this overlap that happens. But a crime is something that's been codified into law, right? And there's a lot of inconsistencies. Oftentimes it's harmful behavior, but there's plenty of other behaviors that we know are just as harmful, but not criminal. So, for instance, or crime. So, for instance, something like smoking cigarettes, right? Smoking cigarettes is incredibly harmful, but it's still legal. And we have to understand, and looking at it critically from the sociological perspective, reasons why it's still legal, right? We have to understand our culture, right? We are rugged individualists. We like this idea of I make my own decisions. I don't want the government making my decisions for me. And so that would be an important thing to kind of consider. But also considering that there's a lot of power, right? That the cigarette companies want to maintain their power, and they will do that through lobbying groups in Congress to get, certain things, or maybe push through, or maybe they'll pivot and they'll start looking at marijuana, right? Because now that's a legal thing and cigarettes aren't as popular, or maybe they'll shift to the vaping thing. So just because a certain behavior is harmful doesn't necessarily mean it will be a crime. So, one thing I always tell students is there's a lot of gray area when it comes to this. Sometimes we just don't have laws for certain behaviors. I recently watched a Netflix documentary about a doctor who was using his own semen to inseminate women when they thought they were getting it from a donor. So many of the children were really upset. And one of the biggest kind of barriers to getting him, obviously, this was a very egregious thing to be doing, but there was no law against this, right? Because it was such a unique thing, right? That obviously, this was a really awful thing to happen to these people, and it caused them a lot of harm. Many of these kids found out that who they thought their dad wasn't their dad, which could be incredibly heartbreaking for a family. But again, because there was no actual law against this behavior, they weren't able to really do anything or prosecute. Next, another important term that we'll be looking through is this idea of delinquency. And delinquency is a term generally afforded for juveniles, right? So you hear this idea of juvenile delinquency kind of set up together. And so you have, any behavior that's, generally a crime will also be a crime for juveniles. But also, when looking at juveniles, can also be in trouble for things like status offenses. So things like not going to school or doing things that are only illegal because of their age. So if a kid is drinking, for instance, under the age of 21, so again, it's only against the law, or, it's only a criminal act because of the age of the offender. And here we'll just go into a little bit more of that overlap. What I want you to get a sense of in sociology is it's not necessarily the behavior, but it's the meaning behind the behavior in terms of whether something is defined as a crime. So, for instance, if a soldier kills during a time of war, that is a form of homicide. They killed someone, right? But obviously, the meaning behind it, right, in that you were protecting the country, is very different than if I just went home and killed my husband because he was, having an affair or something like that. And so it's really important that you understand the social context of what's happening. And obviously, that soldier might be revered for his act, right, of bravery. And so it's not necessarily the behavior, but how the society defines it. We can make the same argument for capital punishment, right? We say don't kill, but then we go ahead and do it. And so it all depends on how society defines this idea. Um, there's also other deviant and other behaviors that overlap with deviance and crime, but kind of go the other way. So, for instance, most of us, when we're out on the road, we will speed. Speeding is relatively normal, right? And in fact, if you were going the speed limit or below, sometimes people will, give you sanctions or show you sanctions by giving you a dirty look. You're in the fast lane going, 2 miles below the speed limit or whatever. And so even things, that are against the law are definitely can still be considered relatively normal. Jaywalking is another one, right? And most of the time, these are infractions; they're not serious. And so you're not gonna, you might get a ticket or something like that. But again, even that is very relative because if you're speeding 10 miles over the speed limit, relatively normal. But now if you're going 45 miles over the speed limit, that's going to change, and you crash or something like that. That's definitely going to change the way, the jury or whoever the judge defines the situation, right? Like that you were engaging in very harmful behavior. And so that might be considered a crime, depending. But overall, you're going to see a lot of gray areas. Sometimes, when it comes to the criminal justice system, prosecutors will try to go for a lesser conviction because they know that they have a better chance of getting that, even though they really think, "Wow, this was really second-degree murder." But I think, I'm going to be much more successful at trying to get a manslaughter conviction. And so, just because things one behavior looks a certain way or whatever, you're going to see a lot of variation, for instance, from state to state. There are variations in laws from state to state, but also the way they do things and stuff like that. So one particular behavior done in one state could have a very different outcome in another. So the next thing we'll look at is how society comes to look at what's considered criminal or not. And generally, it's divided into these two different kind of paradigms. The first paradigm is consensus perspective, and a consensus perspective assumes a consensus from the population, meaning that the majority of the people agree that these laws and rules and things like that are for the common good and that people should obey them. And generally, people internalize these norms and regard them as what's appropriate, right? And so we obey essentially. And so there's this consensus perspective that, hey, these are laws, you need to follow them. Everyone agrees that these are good laws, right? The other side is the idea of the conflict perspective, which has more kind of roots in inequality and ideas that, um, there's not an agreement, right? That it assumes that actually the public does not agree with these laws, that it represents a certain amount of inequality, that laws are created by the powerful and large corporations to maintain their powerful positions. If we looked at the overturn of Roe versus Wade in certain states, you could definitely look at that from the conflict perspective, in that there are quite a lot of folks that do not agree with this particular law, and they also see it very much from the gendered perspective of women not having the same amount of rights as men. Next, we see criminal laws are really set up. with certain goals in mind. And some of these are really obvious. Like many of you already know, laws are created to prevent crime, right? But oftentimes we don't think about this a little bit deeper, that laws are often there. And they also articulate our society's moral values. So if you look at for something like consensual sex work, right? I'm not talking about any coercion involved, but we as a society have said, no, that is not okay. We do not condone or consensual sex work, and it is illegal. And so you can see kind of that morality or that religious lens in terms of how our laws have been set up. Next, you'll see things like protecting the rights and freedoms of the individual. A lot of this stuff is already embedded in our Constitution, and that's where we actually get the laws. But the idea that the police can't just come into your house and start searching without a warrant, and these are really important to a lot of folks. These ideas of individual freedom, again, so many of those that were embedded in our Constitution, the right to free speech, the right to bear arms, right? All of these being so, so important to our identity and our culture in America. When we break down types of crimes even further, we have two different types or two different ways in which we break them down. The first type is mala in se, and mala in se are crimes that are considered evil in themselves. We're talking about things like killing folks, raping, violent crime, really pretty serious property crime. Something that's considered really, really bad in itself. And then we also have a different type of crime considered mala prohibita. And mala prohibita is considered, it's only considered wrong because they are prohibited by law. Something like prostitution or sex work, drug use, right? And this is where we might see a lot of variation across states, across countries. So for instance, in Amsterdam, sex work is legal, consensual sex work. Here it is not. And so again, we're saying it's only wrong because we as a society have kind of said it's wrong, not because it's necessarily like some evil act. And then in defining crime, and again, keep in mind there's a lot of gray area, but felonies are in general, they're considered more serious crimes. Felonies, are examples of felonies include things like murdering, rape, robbery. We're looking at more serious crime, and generally felonies will receive a much harsher punishment, generally a year over. And you are more likely to end up in prison as opposed to jail. Misdemeanors are, on the other hand, are considered less serious. And so we're looking at crimes such as petty theft, prostitution, simple assault, being drunk in public, vandalism, these types of things. There's a lot of variation in terms of this. Obviously, littering or something like that will get you a fine. Vandalism might get you, some time. But for the most part, misdemeanors are considered less serious. You're more likely to serve your punishment in a jail, a local jail, than something like a prison. And generally, the punishments are going to be less than a year. So next we'll look at what's known as actus reus, and actus reus is just simply a fancy name for the act, right? That something happened or didn't happen. And so you either have a crime of commission or a crime of omission. And so a crime of commission would be something like killing someone or doing something to somebody, sexual assault, property crime, robbing, burglarizing someone because you're actually doing something. On the flip side, you have crimes of omission, and this is neglecting to do something that it was your responsibility to do. And so if you are not taking care of your children, that is a crime of omission, right? Not giving the meds to your elderly mother when you're their caretaker and they die because of it, right? And so, in terms of the actus reus, you either have the commission or the omission. Along with the guilty or along with the act, you also need the mens rea. And what mens rea what means is you have to have the guilty mind, right? Like, so if I, forgot to give my mother her medication and they found out that I also had dementia and that's why I forgot, right? I wouldn't have had a guilty mind. I had some kind of something going on with my brain. I didn't mean to do that, right? And so, in trying to determine if it's, you have the guilty mind, and this is very much what juries do, right? And it's complex and hard, and it's not always clear. You have to be able to say that you did it on purpose, right? This wasn't an accident. Like I said, oh my gosh, I'm also suffering. No, no, no. This, I meant to do this. I didn't give my mom her meds because I wanted the inheritance. That you knew, right? That I knew not giving the meds would also, create death for them. So, some of this in terms of knowing, for instance, if you had a 5 year old kill their little brother, it would be awful, right? But you would not say that that 5 year old knew that pulling the trigger would result in this really awful thing. Now, if the kid's 12, that's a little bit different. And so you see, there's a lot of gray area. But of course, if someone was over the age of 18 and they were mentally competent, we would make the assumption that yes, this person knew that pulling this trigger would result in, or could potentially result in, this type of outcome. Next, we look at reckless behavior. This was something I mentioned a little bit earlier, but engaging in really reckless behavior. And so let's say that there's a big football game on and my team wins, and I go out and I just start shooting my gun because I'm like, hell yeah, right? This stuff happens. And I shoot my neighbor who's laying in bed across from me. Of course, I didn't mean to do that, but I potentially knew that shooting my gun all over the place could result in, this was very reckless behavior. This was not happening in a confined space or something like that. Um, and then lastly, criminal negligence. And this is that idea of the crimes of omission, right? So let's say I, neglected, I left my child in the car when it was hot, or I wasn't feeding them, or something like that. But again, I knew, that this would end up in this particular having the guilty mind, right? I knew that leaving a kid in a hot car would potentially kill them. And so again, there's a lot of variation when it comes to this. But generally, this is what the jury, or this is what the prosecutor is trying to show, that the person who committed this act knew what was going to happen, based on their behavior. So now that we've broken down these ideas, you need the actus reus, which is the act, you need the mens rea, which is the guilty mind, and you need that happening at the same time. So you need the concurrence of both of those things happening at the same time. So again, if you had a legit accident, right, where a parent really didn't know that they left their kid in the car, and this has been used in a criminal defense, like I was so tired, I thought I dropped all my kids off. I mean, so they're trying to show this person did not have the guilty mind. They were tired, they had no idea. Now, this is a hard one, right? You're going to see a lot of variation in terms of outcomes for folks. And a lot of that is shaped very much by, the perpetrator's race, class, background, how they are perceived, what's their job, right? Are they an exotic dancer? People are going to look at those types of people very differently than, oh, they were a Bible school teacher. And so that all matters too. And so we definitely see bias within the system as well, which we'll talk a lot more about. What's also really interesting to kind of define is that mens rea doesn't necessarily equal the motive. And also keep in mind, within the criminal justice system, within the court system, you don't have to actually show a motive, but most of the time juries want to know, right? Because it creates that understanding. Why did this happen? What was going on? Were they mad at each other? What was going on? So, it doesn't necessarily matter if you shoot your partner because they were cheating on you, or you stopped giving them their medicine, their life-saving medicine, because you guys had a conversation that, that's what you would do, right? I would pull the plug, so to speak, kind of thing. I'll stop giving you your meds. It doesn't necessarily matter, because in both of these acts, you knew that, shooting your lover would kill them, but also not giving them their meds would kill them. And so it doesn't necessarily matter. It might influence, how the jury comes to decide on punishment. But the motive is not as important as like TV makes it out to be. But a lot of times, juries just want to know because it creates some understanding. Next, we'll look at legal defenses for criminal liability, and essentially these are, what people will claim in terms of trying to defend themselves. So they might say, it was an accident or a mistake. I didn't know. Maybe you thought someone was breaking into your home and you shoot through the door and it was actually your husband on the other side. And you would say, oh my gosh, I didn't know. I thought this was a burglar. It was an accident. It was a mistake. Another criminal defense would be ignorance, right? So you just say, I didn't know. This is not one that has a lot of success. But, in some ways you could see it like if you were traveling in a different state and they had different laws for the road. You could probably claim, hey, I'm from California and in Washington they have very different rules, which we do, believe it or not. So you could say you didn't know, maybe you would get off. So that would kind of be an example of that. Next, you could say you were under duress, right? So there was something happening that you didn't feel comfortable. So when it was during the Vietnam, when soldiers burnt their draft cards, they said they were under duress of their own conscience, that they didn't feel that they could go fight a war and feel ethical, that they were in fear also for their own lives, right? And so they couldn't necessarily do this. So they claimed duress. They were under fear for their own lives. Um, Self defense, right? This is one we hear about oftentimes. Um, in this one, you're just claiming you were defending yourself. It was their life or mine. The jury's going to look at things like how much force was used. And of course, if you stab someone in the back as they were running from you, it's going to be really hard to claim self defense. And so they're going to look at all of those dynamics as well. Um, yeah, so don't go overboard. Next, we'll look at entrapment, and this looks at law enforcement inducing an offender to do something, to do some type of behavior. And so there are laws against this too, in terms of what law enforcement is allowed to do. So, for instance, if I'm a cop, I just can't come up to you and say, hey, you want to do some cocaine with me? Let's do it. And then as soon as you do it, I turn around and arrest you. That would be considered entrapment. Now, law enforcement do things like stings or certain operations where, they have to wait for someone to come and solicit them for drugs. And then once that person pulls it, so there's rules and things like that in terms, but they also have rules that they have to abide by. And if they aren't, then you can claim entrapment. Lastly, we have insanity, and essentially insanity, this is also kind of a rare one. You hear about it a lot, but most people don't get off on insanity. And it doesn't even mean that you're mentally ill. You have to not know what you were doing at the time of the offense, and not have that guilty mind, obviously. So, if you were, for instance, we've heard people try to claim temporary insanity, or I was dreaming, so I was killing my wife in a dream. So again, having that guilty mind, it's a lot harder to determine. And of course, there are people who are legitimately mentally ill and really didn't know what they were doing at the time of their offense. Next, we'll kind of shift gears here a little bit. I wanted to give you all an understanding in terms of how we gain our research in criminology. So, there are two main sources that we get our understanding from. The first one is the Uniform Crime Report. And the Uniform Crime Report, also known as the UCR, is a data collection of all local, or not just local, but all law enforcement agencies. So they'll take the data and get a sense of what's actually happening. But keep in mind, the UCR is only recording crimes that have been caught. And so that's a very small percentage. And so the UCR, is only really getting a picture of that. And that's what I was saying in terms of looking at COVID and crime, because things are moving so fast. And in order to gather the data, it takes a lot of time. And so you're getting a snapshot, when these reports come out, but that might have been from last year. And so what's happening now, might look very, very different. And so other ways that we can get a more accurate understanding of what's happening is what's known as the NCVS, or the National Crime Victimization Survey. And these are surveys that are given to folks like you and I, and this will ask us to account for anything that happened throughout the year. And some of this is really important because obviously not all crimes are reported for all kinds of reasons. So maybe you don't want to get someone in trouble. Maybe you don't want the cops at your house because you're dealing drugs, right? And so there are all kinds of reasons why crimes won't be reported. Maybe someone stole your bike and you're like, the cops aren't going to do anything, which, it's probably not going to be a big priority for them. So maybe you're not even going to bother calling them. And so the NCVS, in theory, gives us a lot broader understanding of what's actually happening, right? Because this is the place where people will record those things that they wouldn't necessarily call the police about. Right. And again, these are ways in which we gain a glimpse or a picture of what's happening. So, in terms of the research process within sociology and criminology, we use what are known as qualitative and quantitative data. Qualitative data is going to be a little bit more subjective. We'll be looking at things like, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, but things like surveys, experiments, interviewing folks, things like that. Quantitative data will engage more with things like statistics and numbers. We have some really fantastic programs within the social sciences, computer programs, that you can input all of this data and then play around with the numbers and get a sense of, look up all kinds of things, because the research has been done for all different types of dimensions. And so, it's really important that we are using the research process correctly, because a lot of times within sociology, there's so many opinions, and without research, they're not valid, right? Especially as you take this class, I want you to always remember you always have to provide the research in terms of your understanding. And maybe that research reflects your opinion, but in sociology, we're not really interested in opinions, which sometimes people get confused about. Um, Everything needs to be backed up by either qualitative or quantitative research. And we'll talk a little bit more about this as well. So, other types of strategies in which we get access to data, we might do things like surveys. Consider the census, for instance, it's a government survey that happens every 10 years, and this gives the government a snapshot of essentially kind of what's happening within households. And as many of you know, what they do is not everyone will get a survey, it's done by a random sample, right? And so, just randomly, a sample will be chosen, and those surveys will go out, and they'll look at response rates and things like that as well. Other ways that we have that we engage in the criminological research, we might look at things like experiments. You're going to be looking at the Stanford prison experiment this quarter. I will say there were a lot of problems with that experiment, but there are some things that Zimbardo got right, which is why I still used it. But essentially, experiments, generally you have a control group and you have a experimental group. And many of you are familiar with this, but kind of like that placebo versus giving someone the real pill. But we'll explore more ways in which we've used experiments in criminology. Another big one is the Milgram obedience study, which is infamous as well. But we'll look at some more of these as we progress in the course. This is just a brief overview. Next, we'll look at observing and intensive interviewing. So sometimes, we will have researchers go into prison and actually sit down with folks for hours to get a sense of what's actually happening. Sometimes they can be very impactful. Sometimes no one will tell you anything. Not everyone wants to tell you their whole life story in terms of what types of crimes they've committed. If they don't trust you, right? And so, often, all of the time, this data and these responses should be confidential. So next, another way that we can gain insight is using existing data, or even comparative research. So studying places that don't have the problems that we have can be really insightful. And of course, there's a whole process within the social sciences on how to do these experiments and surveys and things like that. In fact, when I was an undergrad, I had to take an entire class on survey writing. So again, it gives you, we go really, really deep. But in terms of this class, it's just important that you have an understanding as to how we get our data, right? That it's not just coming randomly, that we're using a really systematic process, the scientific process. So, just to recap our chapter summary, what we were able to do: become familiar with the sociological perspective and understand the mutual relevance of sociology and criminology, be able to understand the rise of sociological criminology, understand the relationship between crime, deviance, and criminal law, understand how consensus and conflict perspective contribute to different definitions of crime and understanding of criminal law, be able to provide an overview of criminal law, including the goals of criminal law, legal distinctions and types of crimes, the meaning of criminal intent, and legal defenses to criminal liability. And lastly, be familiar with the various types of research methods in criminology. So that closes our first chapter here. If you have any questions or need any additional information or dimension, always feel free to reach out. Yeah,